Welcome to this last session of the conference. There are parallel sessions, but it's the last session before the closing ceremony. So basically, I'll do a brief presentation of our panelists and then do a short introduction, and then we'll have the 10-minute presentation, and then we'll have a discussion on the presentation. So we have the pleasure today to have with us Abdul Muheet Chowdhary, who's Senior Program Officer at South Center. Mr. Abdul is Senior Program Officer, Sustainable Development and Climate Change at the South Center. He leads the South Center Tax Initiative, and he's a member of the United States Tax Committee Subcommittee on Wealth and Solidarity Tax. Previously, he served in India's Ministry of External Affairs, where he was the Policy Planning and Research Division specializing in economic strategy. He was formerly a consultant to the United Nations and also worked as a legislative aide in the Parliament of India, specializing in tax and financial law. Beside him, Mounia Boucetta. She's Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South in Rabat in Morocco. She was most recently Secretary of State to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Morocco from 2017 to 2019. She's a graduate from Mohammed School of Engineers in Morocco. She then held managerial function in the public institutions, namely in her capacity of Deputy General Director at CDG Capital and Director General of MADEF, the leading company in tourism investment in Morocco and tourism branch of CDG Group. Since 2020, Mounia Boucetta has held the position of Director Chargé de Mission in the office of the Chairman of and CEO of the OCP Group. She was decorated in 2013 by the Wissam à l'Arche de l'Ordre de Chevalier in Morocco, and also member of the Al-Mana Association for Microfinance. Besides her, Otaviano Canuto, Senior Fellow also at the Policy Center, Principal at the Center for Macroeconomics and Development, and Non-Resident Fellow at Brookings Institute in Washington, former Vice President and Executive Director at the World Bank, Executive Director in International Monetary Fund, and Vice President at the Inter-American Development Bank. He was also Deputy Minister for International Affairs at Brazil's Ministry of Finance, as well as a Professor of Economics at Université São Paulo and University Campesinas in Brazil. So these are our panelists. So the global context of climate change and state of environmental stress faced by developing economy poses an enormous challenge to policymakers. In addition to these challenges, developing countries are faced with, inter alia, technological transition, demographic changes, and growing inequalities. Moreover, developing countries are supporting an unequal burden of the effects of climate change while having contributed the least to this global problem. Other environmental problems such as deforestation, air and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity remain acute in most developing countries. Command and control approaches such as norms and standards were used in many parts of the world as main solution to solve environmental problems, but they have shown to be moderately successful in achieving environmental goals and not very cost efficient. First proposed by Pigou over 100 years ago, environmental taxation were first implemented in Scandinavian countries in the early 90s. Environmental tax and other pricing instruments have gained momentum in the last 10 years. According to the latest World Bank report, over 60 jurisdictions around the world have adopted such measures mainly to reduce greenhouse gases. As has been discussed since the beginning of the conference, environmental tax are appealing for developing countries, but as all forms of tax, they face resistance, and for carbon tax, strong ethical issues are at stake, as was discussed at length in many presentations. Debate is growing in many parts of the South on the relevance to adopt environmental tax, and this is what will be discussed in the three presentations this morning, starting with Abdul Chowdhary, who's going to be talking to us about environmental tax and the carbon in European Union. So the floor is yours. You have your time.
Thank you very much, Luc. So, good morning, and welcome to the last session. And I know it's been like quite a hectic set of 3 days, and thank you for your interest. And it's an honor for me to share the stage with such truly distinguished panelists. So, without further ado, let me begin with my presentation. And the topic is environmental taxation and tax justice in developing countries. So, let's begin with the first slide, where we look at the emissions right now, the top 10 carbon emitters in the world. And we see that China really and the US account for like a large share of this. But if you look at these names, there are quite a few, there's a mix of developed and developing countries. So we see Indonesia, we see Brazil, we see Iran, a lot of oil and gas exporting countries. So it's no longer the case that the carbon emissions, yes, you can see the laser pointer. The carbon emissions are coming mostly from the developed world. Even the developing world is contributing quite significantly to this problem. So this then takes us to what are the possible solutions to deal with this. And one of the biggest solutions which is being proposed is the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism. Over the last 3 days, we've heard a lot of talk of green taxation, carbon taxation, and the CBAM is one of the most practical policy suggestions which is being taken up by the European Union, and considerations are also being taken in the US and I think in Canada as well. So broadly, the way this works is that it would impose a carbon tariff on imports into the European Union based on the level of carbon emissions in the imported product. So, for example, if somebody in the EU is importing coal or steel or some product from a country where it took a lot of emissions to produce that product, then a carbon tariff would be levied on that import. That's basically how it works. And the tariff would be paid by the European importer, not the exporter of the country. So in a sense, it would disincentivize European importers from importing products which have been made in a manner which emits a lot of carbon. And the rationale behind this is that if the EU is undertaking policy measures to reduce emissions, then it might encourage countries to go to companies to go to other countries where it's cheaper to produce and they can basically escape the emission standards. So that they call carbon leakage. So this is a way to kind of address that problem of carbon leakage. So as of now, there have been 7 high carbon emitting industries which have been identified, which I've listed over here, including mining, textiles, chemicals, and so on. And these are likely going to be included into the EU's CBAM. So imports of these products would be basically tariffed at a higher rate. Now, the reality is that most developing countries do not have the technology to really produce these products in a very carbon-friendly manner. So they are likely going to be hit by these tariffs. So what we see is that so far, preliminary estimates of the impact of the CBAM, as it's called, show that it would have a minimal impact on climate and negative impacts on developing countries. So in the Trade and Development Report of UNCTAD, they have estimated, and this is in Chapter 5, that the CBAM will reduce global carbon emissions by not more than 0.1%. So I would just repeat that. The CBAM is probably going to reduce global carbon emissions by not more than 0.1%. So it would have really a very minimal impact on carbon emissions. But on the economy, it would have quite a big impact. So it would decrease global real income by $3.4 billion, with developed countries actually seeing a rise in income by $2.5 billion and developing countries' incomes falling by $5.9 billion. So this is really a huge amount of revenue. And it makes sense because this is going to hit the exports of developing countries and provide more market access to developed countries who can already meet these emission standards. Countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which have big oil and gas exports, will be amongst the top 20 countries most affected, with their real incomes falling by 391 million and 1.4 billion respectively. Many African countries will also be quite affected, including Cameroon, Nigeria, Congo, Ghana, Morocco, and Zimbabwe. So for various reasons, this is being seen quite skeptically by many developing countries and even by developed countries who have a large commodity export base. In fact, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, called this trade protectionism by another name. So this is with regards to the perception of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now we come to the issue of if the pressure is going to be put on developing countries to kind of meet these emissions targets or be faced with a CBAM, how will they get the finance? And under the Paris Agreement, developed countries have basically promised to give $100 billion every year till 2030 to developing countries. And here is the progress of what has come with that commitment. So we have seen that this 100 billion has never been met even once. The highest it ever reached was 83 billion. So the reality is that developing countries who have not really contributed to the climate crisis, to the high level of carbon emissions right now, are being asked to shoulder a disproportionate share of the burden, are not being given the amount of climate finance which they need to basically carry out the kind of green transition which is required. Civil society, the previous figures were provided by the OECD, but if you look at figures provided by civil society, then this estimate is seen to be even lower. So these are estimates by Oxfam for 2019 and 2020. So the OECD's reported 80 billion is actually apparently closer to 20 billion. So it's really much lower than what, according to civil society estimates, the amount of money which has actually come into the pockets of developing countries for climate finance. So it would be quite unfair to expect developing countries to comply with the CBAM, especially when developed countries are not fulfilling their climate finance obligations. A fundamental principle of the climate discussion, or the COP and the UNFCCC, is a common but differentiated responsibility, where the historically responsible developed countries have the main responsibility for reducing emissions. On top of that, carbon taxes have really, I mean, these are taxes on fuel. These would have inflationary effects. It would really put the economies of both developed and developing countries in, I mean, we have seen in France, you had the Yellow Vests protests against these taxes. And so they're politically not a very easy option as well for, I mean, certain types of carbon taxes are not a very politically easy option as well for countries to undertake. So I would like to just look at some alternative options for what developing countries can do. So we see that the extractive industry is quite active in developing countries who have a big natural resource base. We see mining companies, oil and gas companies in developing countries who are big fuel carbon emitters. And these companies often engage in large-scale tax avoidance. To give you some examples, the government of Uganda collected $404 million in capital gains taxes from heritage oil after a big dispute. Mongolia provided a tax assessment of $228 million and a denial of $1.5 billion in carry-forward losses, which is a huge amount of money, to one unnamed taxpayer in the extractives industry. And this amounts of revenue, which, as you can see, would equal, if not exceed, the 100 billion commitment, can provide developing countries with a lot of revenue to finance the green transition. And at the same time, it would also reduce the activities of the extractives industries, which are big contributors to carbon emissions, because when they don't pay taxes, that is equivalent to a subsidy. So in a way, this would be getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, which is something which is talked about a lot, but is not really done because it's difficult for various reasons. So developing countries are actually better off targeting these foreign MNEs in the extractives industry specifically, which engage in tax avoidance and close these tax avoidance loophole. So here I would look at one practical policy tool which developing countries can take, and this is public country-by-country reporting. So this is, in fact, an international standard under the OECD. Action, I think 14 or Action 13 is on country-by-country reporting. And what this does is that it asks every company which has above 750 million euros in global turnover to provide a report of how much taxes they pay in every jurisdiction where they are active and they have revenues from. So these are not provided publicly, these are only provided to the tax administration. But the proposal is that if this data is made public, then tax administrations could know how much is paid in each country. And this would improve auditing risk assessment by tax administrations, enabling them to make more effective tax collection. So this can be initiated for companies in the extractive sector at a minimum and then expanded to other large multinationals. So just to give you a practical example of what this looks like, so Shell, in fact, is a company which has initiated public country-by-country reporting, which is very commendable. So here you can see that in, it's a bit small, unfortunately, but in Albania, for example, or I think Argentina would be a better example, they had 200 million in revenues, and they paid 0 in taxes. And this is data which is available on the internet. So this kind of data really enables tax administrations to see that, okay, these extractive fossil fuel companies are paying taxes here and not really paying taxes there, though they have millions of dollars in revenue. Another example I could give is Bolivia, where they had 119 million in revenues and they paid 0 in taxes. So clearly you can see that something is going wrong. So, so far no country has really initiated public country-by-country reporting because there have been a lot of pressure by the multinationals to keep this data closed and not public. But very commendably, the government of Australia very recently in their budget announced that they are going to start public country-by-country reporting. So this is a snapshot from the Australian budget, and this is a move which all developing countries can and should initiate. And that would help not only their own governments, but all the developing country governments to find out how much money is actually being paid into the pockets. As mentioned before, this would have 2 other impacts. One, the de facto subsidy, because when these companies are not paying taxes, it's equivalent to a subsidy, that would end. And 2, these governments would have more revenue to undertake the green transition. So in conclusion, I would just reiterate that taxes are an essential source of financing the green transition. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, as we can see, will have a minimal impact on emissions reductions, and developing countries can initiate public country-by-country reporting. Another measure which they could introduce is BEPS Action 4. So this is one of the OECD standards which tries to limit interest payments, because interest payments are one of the biggest methods through which profits are shifted and taxes are reduced. And this is used in particular by the extractives industry in great detail. So BEPS Action 4 is another important policy measure for developing countries. And finally, we have the global minimum tax of Pillar 2. And one of the positive effects of Pillar 2 is that it would reduce the need to provide tax incentives or tax holidays to invite companies into the extractive sectors of developing countries, which often they have to do. So these were some policy alternatives to deal with the same problem of reducing carbon emissions, but in a manner which would not harm developing countries, but would actually help them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdul, for your presentation. Now, Mounia, you can.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to be here today. I will have presentation on environmental taxes, especially in Africa. I apologize, I will make my presentation in French. So, okay. Je vais faire juste... Alors, pour parler de l'Afrique, nous allons examiner un peu quels sont les enjeux environnementaux et quelle est la contribution du continent africain dans le cadre des émissions carbone, mais également voir quel impact a la taxation environnementale ou la fiscalité environnementale sur le développement ou la mise en place de politiques de développement durable. Vous savez très bien que les données que nous avons sur l'impact de l'Afrique en termes d'émissions, ce sont des taux qui n'excèdent pas 4% des émissions mondiales. Et les grands contributeurs, c'est essentiellement l'Afrique du Nord et l'Afrique du Sud. Et nous avons en général une grande disparité entre les pays selon leur niveau de développement. Donc on va avoir aussi des niveaux de contribution dans les émissions carbone qui sont variables d'un pays à l'autre. Et généralement, les activités qui génèrent ces émissions, l'industrie reste un élément très négligeable. On le verra dans les graphiques qui vont suivre. Et essentiellement, on va voir tout ce qui est utilisation de la terre ou réaffectation de l'usage de la terre, notamment tout ce qui est déforestation, tout ce qui est expansion de l'agriculture, les dégâts liés aux incendies, toutes les activités d'élevage, ce sont les plus importantes. Mais de plus en plus, durant les dernières années, on voit que l'énergie, la part de l'énergie, est aussi un élément important. Donc là, c'est une courbe qui présente un petit peu l'évolution, comment elle se fait. Et donc, comme je disais, là, sur les 20 dernières années, on voit qu'il y a cette expansion qui est là. Donc, même si le niveau reste très faible, mais il y a une progression assez rapide qui est constatée à l'échelle du continent. Quand on veut voir un petit peu les facteurs, donc là, ce qui est en bleu foncé, c'est la partie qui est liée à l'usage ou la réaffectation de l'usage de la terre. La partie énergétique, c'est elle qui a connu une évolution rapide de 24% en 90 à peu près à plus de 35%. Et donc on voit que l'industrie reste un élément très, très faible compte tenu de la faible industrialisation qui existe. En termes de contribution des pays, donc ce sont juste des graphes pour un petit peu visualiser la part. Donc l'Afrique du Sud qui reste un des contributeurs majeurs avec des pays nord-africains et donc le reste. Donc ça, il y a encore une concentration de contribution au niveau de certains pays du continent. Alors, selon les rapports de l'OCDE, alors l'examen détaillé des taxes, parce que tous ces pays se sont inscrits volontairement dans la partie développement durable et donc ont mis en place des politiques justement pour pouvoir s'inscrire dans la volonté globale de développement durable. Et ces taxes sont variables en fonction je dirais, des secteurs concernés. Et si on prend la définition de l'OCDE, donc on a dans tout ce qu'on appelle fiscalité environnementale, donc on va trouver tous les taxes, impôts, redevances qui ont un effet polluant ou qui sont liés à des produits ou services qui détériorent l'environnement et prélèvent des ressources naturelles. Mais on constate aussi que c'est très difficile d'avoir des statistiques précises sur ce qui est vraiment considéré comme taxe environnementale, justement parce que d'abord, soit qu'il y ait difficulté à avoir ces informations auprès des pays eux-mêmes, des fois il n'y a pas suffisamment de transparence, mais également la granulométrie n'est pas suffisamment fine pour pouvoir apprécier qu'est-ce qui relèverait réellement des taxes environnementales ou non. Et donc ça va être plutôt des pays qui ont des structures transparentes, bien organisées, avec lesquelles on va pouvoir vraiment aller dans le détail et identifier. Mais globalement, c'est les chiffres qui ressortent. En fait, c'est les 30 pays que l'OCDE a pu identifier. On est à 1,1% du PIB en 2019. C'est relativement plus faible que la moyenne pondérée qui serait de 2,2. Et là encore, il y a encore une disparité parce qu'on va avoir des pays dans lesquels cette taxe ne représente que 0,1% du PIB. Et par contre, d'autres pays comme le Nigeria, le Seychelles qui serait presque de 4,7%. Autre point intéressant à voir, c'est que les secteurs les plus taxés, en général, c'est la partie produits énergétiques. Elle représenterait les 2/3. Donc finalement, la fiscalité environnementale, elle est plus orientée vers les produits énergétiques et c'est ce qui fait qu'on a pratiquement 0,7% du PIB qui est collecté à travers ces taxes. D'autres pays ont ciblé la partie transport et moteur diesel. On va voir quelques pays tels que le Botswana, Côte d'Ivoire, le Maroc et autres qui ont ciblé plutôt ces secteurs comme étant les secteurs à taxer pour des raisons environnementales. Pour ce qui est des ressources, c'est plutôt, on va voir en tête de liste, c'est plutôt le Cap-Vert, Mali, qui sont dans cette catégorie, la Mauritanie aussi, qui vont plutôt taxer les ressources. Mais généralement, la partie, je dirais, énergétique reste la grande part. Et bien sûr, l'Afrique du Sud, qui au fait affiche le taux le plus élevé, c'est quasiment 2,8% de son PIB, qui est au fait taxé au niveau de la fiscalité environnementale. Donc ça, il y a une disparité assez importante. On voit un peu la courbe, comment elle évolue. Donc ça rejoint ce que j'ai dit au départ, qu'il y a quelques pays qui ont mis en place des systèmes qui permettent de collecter, de traiter l'information. Et il y a aussi clairement qu'il y a beaucoup de pays qui n'ont pas encore mis en place un système adapté pour justement mettre en place cette fiscalité environnementale. Alors, on sait que globalement, la fiscalité environnementale a été mise en place, c'est pour justement créer un instrument économique productif pour générer, stimuler des choix, les tendances de consommation, pour avoir aussi une technologie qui est plus respectueuse de l'environnement. Et également, n'oublions pas que ça a été aussi une réponse apportée pour dire, on sait très bien qu'il y a un grand déficit au niveau des pays africains, notamment pour tout ce qui est atténuation au changement climatique. La question adaptation et atténuation est un sujet très fort qui est ressorti dans les accords de Paris et pour lesquels il fallait apporter des réponses très explicites en termes de financement. Et donc, beaucoup de pays en voie de développement, quand on va parler de quelle est la contribution des pays développés en termes de mobilisation de ressources, vont dire, vous avez une possibilité de faire, c'est d'activer de la fiscalité environnementale. Jusqu'à quel niveau cette recette pourrait être viable, efficace et permettre à répondre à des besoins écologiques de développement environnemental. C'est la question qu'on se pose. Parce que vraiment, quand on analyse la bibliographie, les taxes environnementales pour les pays en voie de développement, ça a émergé comme étant une alternative pour répondre aux besoins de financement en termes d'atténuation et d'adaptation. Alors, dans cette analyse globale, on trouve qu'il y a deux courants, deux partisans. Il y a ceux qui considèrent effectivement que ces taxes sont essentielles et que les pays en développement, notamment les pays africains, pourraient générer de la ressource viable, pourraient déjà anticiper des problématiques dans lesquelles se trouvent aujourd'hui les pays en développement pour orienter les consommateurs, pour orienter le secteur privé vers des solutions plus viables et plus durables. C'est un constat qui peut se respecter et qu'on peut considérer qu'il a du sens. Mais en même temps, on a une autre catégorie, sur la base d'analyse et d'études et de recherche, qui conteste ce principe en disant c'est introduire de telles taxes peut créer des distorsions fiscales. Il peut créer des interactions qui ne servent pas forcément le développement, qui peuvent avoir un impact social sur les populations. Et qu'effectivement, on sait que beaucoup de pays développés se sont inscrits dans cette logique de fiscalité environnementale, notamment au niveau de l'Europe, les pays nordiques et autres, il y a plus d'une vingtaine d'années qui sont investis et qui ça a effectivement permis d'orienter vers des technologies plus vertes, plus écologiques. Ça a permis aussi de sensibiliser le consommateur, ça a permis de développer des investissements et l'innovation dans les secteurs industriels qui sont plus écologiques. Mais leur environnement de base ou le cadre socio-économique a permis justement d'avoir cet impact direct. Pour des pays en développement ou des pays africains, où il y a encore, le consommateur peut ne pas avoir d'alternative, quand on lui dit qu'il ne faut pas utiliser du charbon ou du bois pour se chauffer, pour cuisiner, et qu'on va surtaxer ces produits, quelle alternative il a? Donc finalement, c'est un impact qui peut être juste un coût social sans qu'il y ait d'alternative. De la même manière, comment est-ce qu'on peut être certain que les recettes collectées à travers cette taxe environnementale vont être réinjectées dans des activités écologiques, dans des activités d'investissement à impact positif sur l'écologie, si on n'a pas d'éléments fiables sur le plan gouvernance, sur le plan transparence, et ainsi de suite. Donc, prendre des mesures qui, je dirais, on peut avoir un impact, mais là aussi on pourra le voir tout à l'heure, pour s'interroger sur le niveau d'efficience et d'efficacité de tel système. Donc, prendre un système tel que, dans un environnement particulier, qui a une certaine maturité, une certaine logique de consommation et autres, et transposer le même modèle pour dire aux pays en voie de développement africains, vous devez appliquer ce système, ça va vous générer de ressources pour répondre à vos besoins écologiques, ça me semble qu'il y a un raccourci très fort et qui finalement ne tient pas compte des réalités et qui peut creuser davantage les inégalités. Alors, l'application de la fiscalité environnementale peut-elle générer de ressources? C'est une question qu'on pose réellement pour voir. D'abord, on a vu qu'avec tout ce qui est aujourd'hui mis en place, on générerait du 1,1, alors que globalement, on sait que les besoins d'atténuation, les besoins d'adaptation dépasseraient les 5% du PIB. Déjà, ce n'est pas une réponse réellement et totale. Elle pourrait contribuer, mais finalement, vu les besoins réels au niveau de l'Afrique, ça ne pourrait pas représenter une part assez importante pour justement répondre aux enjeux et répondre aux défis auxquels fait face l'Afrique. Et se restreindre à cette solution magique de dire adopter des taxes environnementales pour résoudre vos problèmes écologiques, ça ne pourrait pas se faire puisque les besoins sont beaucoup plus importants et sont en train de grandir et d'augmenter vu l'industrialisation qui est là, vu le besoin. On le sait, d'ailleurs, on dit que Africa will food the world, donc c'est l'agriculture prochaine va être beaucoup plus sur le continent africain. Donc il va y avoir encore plus de demandes sur le continent en termes de ressources, en termes de produits alimentaires et autres. Et donc, comment accompagner au mieux cette transition énergétique ou écologique au niveau du continent pour justement servir le monde de manière générale. Alors, la fiscalité environnementale, à mon sens, devrait être dans une logique globale. Penser à une mesure isolée sans tenir compte des autres éléments qui devraient être engagés, c'est également ne pas avoir fait l'analyse globale du secteur parce que la fiscalité ne constituerait qu'un des éléments et qu'il y a d'autres drivers, il y a d'autres éléments à intégrer pour justement avoir l'efficacité et l'efficience qu'on recherche. Est-ce que la taxation ou la fiscalité environnementale ne risque pas de développer des pratiques illicites? J'ai évoqué tout à l'heure la question de dire qu'il y a des ménages au niveau de beaucoup de pays qui se chauffent, qui cuisinent avec le feu de tout ce qui est charbon et autres. Si demain on décide qu'il y a une taxation forte justement pour dissuader, il n'y a pas d'alternative. Ils n'ont pas d'alternative. Donc il va y avoir des marchés illicites qui vont s'installer et donc on va avoir des situations informelles. Ou bien on pourrait avoir des pratiques, chaque fois qu'il y aura une taxation auprès de produits justement pour réorienter la consommation, c'est des marchés parallèles qui s'installent. Parce que déjà, au niveau de nombreux pays, le poids de l'informel est assez élevé. Et donc c'est très difficile déjà d'imposer, de surcharger avec de la taxation, dans la mesure où le système n'est pas totalement viable et qui n'est pas totalement transparent, justement pour mesurer l'impact. Et donc, plusieurs pays africains ne sont pas en mesure de vraiment ni d'anticiper, ni d'appréhender réellement quel serait l'impact d'une telle instauration. Et c'est pour ça que s'il y a un accompagnement à faire pour ces pays, pour justement, moi je ne dis pas que la taxation environnementale ne devrait pas être appliquée, au contraire, mais je dis qu'elle devrait rentrer dans une logique globale qui prend en considération l'enjeu ou la situation socio-économique de chaque pays. Ce n'est pas des recettes qu'on peut dupliquer comme ça, telles qu'elles sont, et qu'elles vont générer de l'impact réel. Il va falloir prendre en considération les enjeux de développement socio-économique de chaque pays, sur quoi il se projette dans les années à venir, quelles sont les mesures à mettre en place, quel est le dynamisme de son secteur privé, quel est le dynamisme de sa société civile, quels sont les comportements de ses consommateurs et pouvoir mettre en place quelque chose qui ait du sens pour que justement ça ne produit pas des effets inverses en termes d'inégalité, en termes de retard, en termes quasiment même de prolifération de pratiques informelles et illicites qui vont encore nous remettre en arrière. je voulais aussi partager un point parce que on se dit, même en termes d'impact, là encore, beaucoup d'analyses sont faites sur les taxes environnementales, on veut y développer, et je me suis intéressée à ça pour dire réellement quelle analyse fait-on après 20 années d'application sur les pays qui ont été très disciplinés dans l'application de ces taxes, et on voit qu'il y a beaucoup d'analyses assez intéressantes. D'abord, les pays où ça a marché, où les taxes environnementales ont été vraiment un vrai vecteur de changement et de transition écologique dans le choix, dans les technologies, dans l'innovation. Aujourd'hui, il voit le recette baisser. C'est tout à fait normal parce que justement, quand une fiscalité marche bien, ça veut dire que le consommateur n'utilise pas, ça veut dire que les recettes vont commencer à baisser. Et donc finalement, ce ne sont pas des recettes viables. Et je reviens à l'argument de départ qui a été mis en place, c'est de dire la fiscalité environnementale ce sont des recettes pour les pays en voie de développement. Et finalement, ce sont des recettes qui ne sont pas forcément viables parce qu'elles ont tendance après à diminuer. L'autre idée de dire il est pertinent de transférer la fiscalité, donc baisser la fiscalité sur les capitaux, le travail pour la transférer vers la fiscalité environnementale, c'est aussi des tests sur la base des analyses qui ont été menées notamment en Europe, aux pays nordiques. On voit que finalement, il n'y a pas eu cet effet de changement qui a favorisé l'emploi et l'investissement. Au contraire, on n'arrive pas à corréler aujourd'hui. Est-ce qu'effectivement, la fiscalité environnementale a eu un effet réel sur le capital et sur l'emploi? Et puis, en dernier, tout ce qui est décarbonation, donc l'assiette fiscale a été réellement érodée et que finalement, l'élément de dire je génère plus de recettes n'a pas été forcément atteint. Et donc, on se pose la question de l'application d'un tel modèle au niveau des pays en développement. Quelles sont les mesures d'accompagnement qu'il va falloir adresser, analyser? Quel type d'analyse doit-on faire avant de commencer à appliquer ou à comparer aussi? Parce que des fois, il y a des comparaisons, à mon sens, qui ne tiennent pas compte de l'ensemble des leviers. En termes de conclusion, je voudrais revenir sur le fait que les pays africains sont déjà très lourdement par un ensemble de défis et de challenges socio-économiques, des questions de développement cruciales, les crises Covid, les questions de sécurité alimentaire qui sont redevenues des sujets importants après la succession des dernières crises, que ce soit la crise du conflit régional Russie-Ukraine, que ce soit le Covid. Donc on revient sur des questions que certains pays commencent à dépasser, notamment en termes de famine et de sécurité alimentaire. Ce sont des questions qui reviennent. Donc tout ce qui est food security, energy security, sont des questions qui redeviennent centrales. Donc il y a plusieurs défis et avec le poids de l'informel. Donc quelles recommandations doit-on faire quand on parle des taxes environnementales? Quelle application? Quel est le meilleur moyen d'accompagner pour justement ne pas alourdir davantage et que réellement ces politiques puissent apporter un effet de levier qui crée réellement des opportunités et qui puisse aussi donner de la perspective. Et donc c'est là où je pense qu'il faudrait intervenir tous les politiciens, mais également tous les chercheurs qui analysent les données, qui font des comparaisons pour voir quels sont les meilleurs facteurs ou les meilleurs leviers sur lesquels on peut agir, quelle approche holistique, approche globale qu'on pourrait mettre en place pour justement générer ce développement viable et durable pour le globe tout entier. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Mounia. So we'll move to the next presentation. Otaviano, you can.
Well, good morning, everybody. Really a pleasure and honor to be again at a Global Development Conference after a couple of years in such a good company. And my task is simplified by the fact that we had two great presentations before that laid out to different extents complementary views on the topics that that I'm supposed to also say something. So I will be able to be very brief. Now, the advantage of framing the discussion on environmental taxation and social justice in developing countries, as it is the title of this session, is that it is a step beyond a very common feature of discussions on tax, which tend to be framed in two silos. Say, I'm old enough to have gone through so many discussions sometimes on tax justice, connecting the features of the tax system and social equity, and also have been in other instances in which we have a fierce discussion on environmental tax and the impact and the relationship between taxes and the environmental results. What is not very common is to lump them together, to get them together. Because once we do that, we realize that there is very often a trade-off between both objectives. Very often, a design of taxes to address environmental issues may be very bad for social equity purposes, and vice versa. So we need to frame the discussion in the way that we try to locate which are the trade-offs with respect to different kinds of tax systems and so on, as well as the synergies. So that's why I do believe it's very much opportune to break those two silos and to always or try to make a discussion that is a joint one. And of course, don't have to tell you still the relevance of taxation with respect to social equity. Remember Professor François Bourguignon? That's the man who laid out the great step in the work of the World Bank in measuring and addressing poverty and so on. We do have an issue with global inequality and inequality within countries that will inevitably need to have to put the nexus between tax and social equity at the forefront on the one hand, but also the question of what will take for us really to manage to go through the energy transition that we all aim for towards less carbon emission and so on, which cannot be taken for granted, of course, and where the role of environmental taxation, including carbon pricing, has implications. I spoke about the nexus on environmental taxation and equity issues. It suffices to take into account the regressive nature of environmental taxes, which corresponds to only one aspect of inequality associated with environmental policies. We have inequality not only on the exposure to environmental degradation, but we also have the distributional consequences of policies regarding environment. We all know, it's quite clear now that a major challenge in this trajectory towards decarbonization will be greenflation, right? It will be the fact that we will have to live with a difference in efficiency as of now, yet a remaining margin of disadvantage of renewable forms of energy, with some exceptions, vis-a-vis the conventional ones, fossil fuel-based. That has to be in the price. We also have to live with the challenge associated with tapping to new types of inputs. We will have a shift towards minerals and out of the conventional production of fossil fuels, and that's okay, but that's going to be costly, inevitably. And we also have, which leads me to the third point, the dire need of a carbon price. Yeah, pricing carbon is such an important component of the adequate price signaling, because we need to have the incentives in place to lead agents to move out from carbon-intensive activities. And so we need the price. We need to price the carbon. And the problem is that it's easier said than done. Not by chance I'm using here the simulations made by our ex-colleagues from the IMF on the different options of price. Ideally, we would need a universal carbon price. That is to say, an agreed methodology to measure the carbon intensity of different production processes and products, and a common carbon price, so as to let's say, not inflict any risks of competitiveness strains, as Abdul highlighted as well. Ideally, we need a universal carbon price. But let's face it, under the current circumstance, it doesn't seem very much likely, at least not in time, given the strains on multilateralism and so on. And that's why, maybe that's where I have a caveat to make to Abdul's very strong points about the CBAM, which is the following. I see the carbon border adjustment mechanism as a second best, maybe a third best, maybe a fourth best, okay, Abdul? But the fact of the matter is that one would not think of the Europeans, for instance, establishing any carbon price if they do not accompany it by some sort of this kind of adjustment at the margin, because otherwise it would be a shoot on its own foot, in the sense that everything you would end up importing, and in fact, maybe overall increasing the emission by transferring production to areas, to countries and processes of production that would be even more carbon intensive. So I understand the rationale for an adjustment at the margin, at least to ring fence the Europeans themselves. And who knows, maybe as the other countries also go on to establish carbon pricing compatible, then the adjustment mechanism would not be necessary. The point is that although it is a suboptimal policy, but it's understandable if at least to see it being implemented somewhere in the global system, because we are very far from what would be needed in terms of pricing carbon to, let's say, to get close to the trajectories estimated by our friends at the IMF. The effects of carbon pricing are substantial. Just for the sake, don't worry, I will not go here into the detail, but I would call your attention to the fact that estimates have shown how carbon pricing functions. It may induce behaviors that lead to the corresponding adoption of new practices and so on. And in the South, the emerging markets and developing countries is where we will have to see action. It's unfair. Climate change is asymmetric. That's why we have to recognize the common but differentiated responsibilities. So the countries that have been mostly responsible for the carbon emission are not those who will suffer most in relative terms from climate change. But no one can deny the need to have also an energy transition in developing countries themselves. It's not the approach of exempting the developing countries of doing something just because it would be asymmetric. I don't think we will need to have the energy transition on both sides of the equation. Of course, and this chart, I took it from the Atlantic Council, the Geoeconomics, because it highlights, the asymmetries in the population, the asymmetries in energy investment, at least as estimated for 2019, and of clean energy investment. But it's still, in absolute terms, you need to have the investments in energy, in clean energy in the developing countries as part of the equation. This, Abdul used the same chart, so I don't have to. Maybe the dates are different, but lack of commitment by advanced economies, which calls attention to the fact that reality is domestic resource mobilization in developing countries themselves will also be necessary. You cannot rely simply on falling from heaven grant distribution from advanced economies. To finalize, I used two recent reports to something that we can say with respect to the trade-offs and the treating the relationship between tax and social equity and tax and environmental, not as silos. A couple of things that we can say that we know. For instance, about there is a difference between applying a tax directly aimed at the pollutant itself versus applying a tax on an element of pollution, of source of negative externalities. Applying a tax on the pollutant, is to say, usually it's been in the evidence harnessed by those reports that I showed, show clearly how there is a greater environmental effectiveness when you tax the pollutant, not the activity. In terms of design as well, of course, another policy recommendation that is not necessarily often followed is the point that the taxes should have the broadest possible coverage, minimizing really the exceptions, because otherwise any one of us who has had experience in policy making know that whenever some exemptions like those are negotiated, you may be sure that there will be a flocking of people towards those exemptions, and the exemptions become the norm rather than the exception. We also, the policymakers also have to be aware that the successful application of some environmental tax, if it is successful as we wish, will ultimately lead to the disappearance of the source of revenue, right? Which is a good thing, but you have to be ready for that. And one important thing is the following. I come from Brazil. Brazil, like Mexico, have been a case of countries that have successfully used conditional cash transfers, right? Not golden pill to solve all problems of misery and poverty, but wow, there has been a measured positive impact in terms of poverty reduction and so on. And this instrument has become, let's say, quite strong universally. On the other hand, in some cases, even it has evolved towards unconditional compensation. The point that these reports call attention to is the following. Maybe when it comes to energy transition, you'd rather, instead of having simply unconditional compensation, to the extent of possible, to really implement transformative social welfare policies, or at least co-benefits, co-benefit policies designed so as to foster the green economy transition. The hands-off approach with respect to transfers and poverty reduction, which are straightforward and successful, maybe in the case of if you want to have the combination with environmental policies, it should be a little bit beyond simply transferring money. The role of border tax adjustments that I mentioned, and obviously I read plus type approach could work in tandem with other forms of environmental taxation. I had put it here, the plastic tax in Morocco, but I would leave it to Madame Mounia, because she was one of the implementers. And the reason why I hadn't mentioned it here is because it's one of those cases where we learn a lot about exactly this combination of both social and social equity and environmental impacts of taxation. So we'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I won't summarize this presentation to keep more time for the discussion and potentially debate to CBAM or not to CBAM. So I'll open the floor for questions and discussion, and then so we'll take the questions. The panelists will note them, and then we'll have a round of response. And so here, there's one question here. Okay, we can start here.
Okay, thank you. My name's Jacqueline Cottrell. I'm a freelance consultant associated with Green Budget Europe. I'd like to thank you very much for your presentations. I really enjoyed them, really enjoyed the various aspects of environmental taxation that you looked at. I'd like to make a few comments and to start the discussion, I think. First of all, I think it's important, if we're talking about domestic revenue mobilization, to be very clear about how much we can expect environmental taxes to achieve. As we saw in the last presentation there, if a tax is effective, obviously the tax revenues are going to fall. There are design solutions to that, tax escalators and so on. But I think we have to be careful how much we want taxes to achieve, and environmental taxes are perhaps not the best taxes if we're looking at domestic revenue mobilization aside from carbon taxes. And on that point, what I'd like to just briefly report is we had a panel yesterday looking at environmental taxation as well. And there I think all of the speakers were agreed that CO2 taxes are probably not the best taxes for very many low and middle income countries. Of course, there are exceptions, the big emitters, and in that context, or in any context, you'd have to look at each country very carefully and develop an integrated country-specific policy proposal. I really agree with that point as well. It's all about careful design and making sure that it's appropriate to the country context. And in many countries, carbon taxes are not the biggest challenge that these countries are facing. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa, they've got a very low carbon footprint, but they have huge health challenges that they might have to address. And it might be that environmental taxes are a way of implementing measures that can address those health challenges by reducing pollutants. If you introduce, for example, so I'm speaking a bit in support, I suppose, of environmental taxes. If you introduce a differentiated tax on, for example, high sulfur diesel and low sulfur diesel, you can see very often a very rapid response to that. So I think there are very many environmental taxes that have been effective, and I think if you introduce them in the right way and carefully, perhaps you'll talk about Morocco and the plastics tax to kind of back that up. So in a way, I wanted to speak out a bit in defense, because there have been some criticisms, and I think what you have to think about is if you talk about environmental taxes, that's a huge bag. That's not just carbon taxes. That's also very many other taxes. So that's my first point. I'd love to hear a few comments on assuming the CBAM comes in, which it looks like it will. What would your solution be under those circumstances? For example, would you support third countries that are least developed countries, for example, being exempted, or within that framework? I'd be interested to hear if the panel have concrete proposals on how the CBAM could be improved. And then finally, I wanted to thank Otaviano Canuto, because you showed 2 reports that I contributed to in your sources, and that's always very gratifying. So thank you very much.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. Christian from the University of Namur and former head of the Tax Policy Directorate at the Belgian Ministry of Finance. On the CBAM, my question is, finally, what is the main policy rationale for having a CBAM? Is it on the economic side, or is it on the political economy side? Having in mind that there is a literature that indicates that carbon leakage may be not so damaging as we thought they could be, but on the political side, competitiveness is well known as being the most important obstacle for the introduction of carbon pricing. So the alternative view is that countries that are within need a CBAM to be able to introduce the carbon pricing, and it's an incentive for countries that are out of the club to join the club. So my question, is it economics or is it or politics? Ma deuxième question, c'est sur la deuxième présentation, donc je vais la faire dans la langue de la présentation. Je vous rejoins tout à fait sur le fait que, bon, une taxe carbone dans les pays africains sans un transfert de fonds pour financer la transition climatique, ça n'a pas beaucoup de sens. Mais bon, je ne suis pas tout à fait d'accord, c'est sur ce qu'on sait sur l'efficacité des taxes carbone en termes de réduction des émissions, parce que, bon, les études empiriques qu'on a concernent des taxes ou de la tarification du carbone, si on prend le système des permis échangeables en même temps, concernent des cas où en fait des pays les ont introduits de manière isolée ou des blocs de manière isolée pour le système ETS en Europe, et où on a dû donner des tas d'exemptions, ce qui veut dire que leur efficience a été diminuée par les exemptions dont la plupart ont été motivées par le fait que les pays agissaient de manière isolée. Donc c'est quand même un peu délicat de généraliser ça dans un autre contexte, etc. And my final point is on the regressivity of carbon pricing. I do not contest it, but the issue today is not do we introduce a carbon tax or not. The issue is that we have the Paris Agreement and we have to do something. This means that what matters from a distributional point of view is not the distributive consequence of carbon tax as such, but in comparison with other options. And if you compare regulation, subsidies, and tax, to say it very briefly, regulations raise an issue of affordability for the poor. Subsidies are well known to be regressive, and they have a cost for the budget and they have a cost for future generation, while carbon tax, you may use the revenue to compensate the adverse effect on the poor. So finally, I think we should raise the right issue is what choice between regulation, subsidies, and tax, having in mind social justice and not carbon tax alone. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. There are three questions. We'll start with Alain, Ariane, and Mario, and François. Try to be brief so we can have the four questions in the panel.
Merci. Je commence. Alain Carcentier du CIRAD. C'est une question pour Madame Boucetta. Vous avez effectivement mentionné les différents postes d'émission, notamment en Afrique. Vous avez montré l'importance du changement d'usage des terres et de la déforestation. Mais vous n'êtes pas trop revenu dessus. Vous avez ensuite un peu bifurqué sur la taxe carbone. Alors, je dirais qu'une des questions qu'on se pose, même si, à mon avis, la question de la fiscalité a un tout petit rôle à jouer, mais enfin, elle a un rôle, comme vous dites, c'est bien dans les mix d'instruments et dans les approches globales qu'on va trouver peut-être des solutions. Mais je me demandais dans cette affaire s'il ne fallait pas considérer précisément le potentiel de la fiscalité, mais alors complètement sous une forme fiscalité verte, c'est-à-dire sous une forme avec comme seul objectif de modifier les comportements. C'est-à-dire précisément de pénaliser les formes d'expansion agricole qui vont introduire beaucoup d'émissions de CO2 par de la déforestation, par exemple. Et hier, j'ai présenté dans une session des mécanismes de bonus-malus, c'est-à-dire des systèmes qui effectivement sont budgétairement neutres, qui permettent effectivement de rémunérer des pratiques qui sont intéressantes du point de vue écologique et au contraire de pénaliser progressivement celles qui le moins, qui causent le plus d'émissions de CO2 ou de perte de biodiversité, si vous voulez, notamment termes de déforestation. Bon, sur le cacao, sur la forêt, etc., on commence à avoir des exemples. Donc la question, c'est est-ce que pour vous, il y a un potentiel dans le secteur justement agricole et land use qui peut être intéressant et jusqu'où ça peut aller?
Merci. Ariane?
Thank you. Thanks very much for three great, important presentations. I'm wondering whether my question arises from the fact that it's so cold here, and maybe that's affecting my thinking. I didn't hear the word energy poverty, though, and I'm really wondering. I mean, there's a lot of, to your point, we need to bring the environment and the justice side together, and I think that's, for economics, probably the most important contribution to do that well. A lot of the discussion has been on the compensation through social spending. 800 million people don't have access to energy, particularly for the African continent. We cannot argue for reducing a carbon footprint without thinking about it. So I was wondering, perhaps mostly to Madame Boucetta, to think about how that providing access to energy to the poor in low-income countries fits into that perspective. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. Mario?
Merci. So my question, at the cost of repeating what Christian asked, so over the past few days, I heard a lot about the need for more money for climate issues. And I'm a little bit confused between, is it about adaptation or is it about correcting behavior? And if it's about correcting behavior, it seems to me that before we jump to carbon taxes, there's a lot that can be done through tax systems today. And just to mention a few examples, taxation of transportation in Africa, for example, taxation of vehicles, of construction, in the standard taxes. I'm talking about the regular excises and VAT that apply today. These are not, new tools. And obviously, the biggest item is taxation of energy, particularly fuel products. And I would like to hear your views, because I also need to write a summary to my management about the key messages I took from the conference. Is this whole, you mentioned, for example, it's the whole approach that matters. What is this whole approach? Can we prioritize things that can be done in existing systems before jumping to new tools? Or is it absolutely necessary to have new tools because only new tools will bring in a lot more money? So is it really only about the money, or is it about correcting behavior by letting prices a little bit play their role, which is not the case nowadays in many sectors? And I'd love to hear your views about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. François, the last question, and then we'll get the panel to respond.
Yes, my remark goes very much in the same direction. I think that we should be clear about what we expect from taxation in that field. Do we expect to raise revenues, or do we expect to change, to provide incentives for people to change behavior? This may be through a carbon tax. This may be, as Mario just said, through taxing some activities which are producing directly or indirectly carbon emission. This may be done in different ways. But I think it is quite important at the beginning to be clear on what we want to achieve. And if indeed the process, the taxation, is successful in modifying in behavior, let's imagine that at the end, indeed, the revenue from those corrective taxes is going down, then there is other ways we can raise revenues. And this has been the discussion that we had over the last 2 days. So I think it is really quite important to have that in mind. And my second point is, it is about justice. And I would like to remind you that when the whole discussion started, you may remember the double dividend story about carbon taxation, and the idea that it would be fantastic to have to tax carbon, because in that case we would be reducing labor taxes and it would be contributing to better employment. There was a big debate about this. And some people say, okay, this is completely wrong. There is nothing like a double dividend. If you want to reduce labor taxes, you can increase another tax, and it does not need to be the carbon tax. But most importantly, there was a view that if we are serious about considering a carbon tax as a corrective tax, then there is no reason to, for the government to use the revenue of the tax for other purposes. The idea, the proposal, has been to redistribute the product of the tax, the revenue of the tax. And to say, okay, on the one hand, you will be taxed on your consumption of carbon-emitting material, but on the other hand, you will be given a lump sum, a cash transfer, which will, for some, fully compensate the cost of the tax, and for others, undercompensate. But the main point was, in this system, was to say this tax will correct behavior. And just after the Stern report on the climate change, there was another conference just after, no, I think it was just after the Paris conference. There was a conference where some people insisted on the fact that there is no reason to consider that the carbon tax would be another source of revenue for a government. Revenue should come from something else.
Thank you, François. So I'm tempted by asking a question, but there's not going to be any time to respond. So maybe Mounia has a couple of questions were directly addressed to you. I'll put you on the spot to respond, and then you can pass the mic to you.
En tout cas, merci beaucoup. En tout cas, c'est une opportunité aussi pour préciser mes propos. Je sais que des fois, dans les présentations, les idées peuvent ne pas être suffisamment claires. Il y a un élément qui est central et il n'est pas du tout contesté, c'est les engagements que devraient avoir les pays en voie de développement pour tout ce qui est transition écologique. Les enjeux écologiques environnementaux sont d'une telle importance, de survie même, je dirais une importance ayant un impact de survie sur nous et les générations futures, et aussi bien les pays développés que les pays en voie de développement doivent y adhérer et doivent s'inscrire dans une logique qui nous permet tous de générer cette transition écologique. Donc ça, c'est un fait, il n'est pas du tout contestable ni rien du tout. Le point sur lequel je voulais insister, c'est de dire qu'il y a un ensemble de mesures qui ont été mises en place par beaucoup de pays développés, qui ont généré des effets. Vous l'avez signalé effectivement qu'il y avait une réduction des émissions de gaz à travers le changement des comportements. Mais en même temps, on se dit, est-ce que juste on se limite à ce regard réducteur, à mon sens, de voir que ces mesures, on peut les dupliquer telles qu'elles sont au niveau des pays en voie de développement. Au niveau de la pyramide de Maslow, il y a des niveaux, donc il y a les pays qui sont dans des niveaux de pauvreté très élevés, des pays qui ont des niveaux de développement ou des revenus moyens, et puis ceux qui ont les conditions nécessaires de développement. Donc les mesures ne peuvent pas s'appliquer de la même manière parce que justement quand on aborde des questions écologiques, des questions d'environnement, il y a aussi d'autres problématiques qu'il faudrait intégrer. Comme il y a des effets et des interactions, d'ailleurs même dans les SDGs, les ODD, les éléments d'interaction entre objectifs est un élément qui aujourd'hui nous interpelle dans tout ce qu'on fait. Quand on essaie d'agir sur un indicateur, il faudrait s'assurer qu'effectivement cet indicateur n'affecte pas l'autre. Et c'est de là où mon interprétation sur la question de attention aux inégalités, attention. Donc sur les mesures, je pense que là il y a consensus, on va dire général. Maintenant sur la manière de le faire. C'est là où il faudrait, ça nous interpelle tous, politiques, ça nous interpelle tous en tant que chercheurs, en tant qu'analystes, aussi bien au niveau des pays développés et en voie de développement, pour essayer de trouver quels sont les meilleurs mécanismes. Parce qu'il ne faudrait pas qu'après 10 ans, on se rende compte que finalement, cette mesure qu'on a défendue, qu'on a soutenue, qu'on a essayé d'appliquer, on se rend compte que finalement, on a perdu 10 ans et qu'il fallait refaire les choses autrement. Et il y a un élément qui est réel et ça ne changera pas. L'Afrique est en train de grandir par sa population, également par tout le potentiel de développement qui va venir. sur le plan industriel, énergétique, agriculture, c'est une réalité. Et que cette transition écologique de l'Afrique, elle doit être bien faite. C'est ça le point. C'est qu'il faudrait vraiment trouver tous les mécanismes, toutes les mesures nécessaires pour que justement on ne rate pas le coach. Parce qu'on ne peut pas se permettre de rater le coach. Avec différentes mesures qu'on peut appliquer et on ne peut pas juste regarder quel est l'impact sur l'émission effet de gaz. Moi, j'ai d'autres critères à voir en même temps. Impact sur les émissions, oui, d'accord. Quel est l'impact sur le développement, l'avancement de mon développement? Quel est l'impact sur le progrès? Quel est l'impact sur la chaîne globale, mondiale? Donc, ce sont des choses qui, au fait, nous mettent beaucoup plus de pression et de challenge par rapport à notre manière de penser, par rapport à notre manière de faire, tous ensemble. C'est là où je mets l'accent. Mais je ne remets pas en cause que, oui, effectivement, ça change les comportements. Oui, ça change les comportements. Mais dans mes comportements, j'ai des besoins. Comment faire agir les deux? Comment concilier les deux? C'est là où la question se pose. Et je suis tout à fait d'accord qu'il y a aujourd'hui beaucoup de pratiques pour développer de l'agriculture écologique, beaucoup de programmes justement pour faire un meilleur usage de l'eau, que choisir des fertilisants qui n'impactent pas l'environnement et que là, on peut mettre beaucoup d'incitatives. C'est ce qui est en train d'être mis dans beaucoup de pays pour justement encourager les pratiques écologiques. Mais toujours le sujet de développement doit être à mon sens présent dans la manière à laquelle on va également engager les sujets environnementaux. C'était ça la perspective que je voulais.
Otaviano, a last response to...
Great. Very briefly. First, on the political and economic dimensions of CBAMs and so on. As always, there are two sides of a coin. Definitely an economic motivation, but I've been in a debate, for instance, where one participant argued that agriculture could not be out of that equation, that the carbon content on the European agriculture should have been contemplated and so on. But we fully understand the political difficulties to establish a carbon tax on agriculture in Europe. So there's both sides. Devil is always in the details. But the economic rationale for the CBAM is overall, I would say, there. To compensate for not to create any asymmetry between local producers and outsiders. Otherwise, you may end up leading to a scenario that's even worse than the one without the carbon tax. On the carbon pricing, and Professor Francois said it all, look, there is a limit to which we can conduct that harmonization of the two styles I mentioned. At the end of the day, you have to define what is your priority. When you talk about environmental taxation, ultimately, the raison d'être is to curb the environmentally unfriendly activity. That is not as a substitute for other forms of domestic resource mobilization. It's not revenue making. And to the extent of possible, if it succeeds, it is to be phased out later on. But the point that I want to highlight is the following. Price, you need price to change behavior. Agents respond to price, not morale, exclusively morale, incentives, or even subsidies. They operate by changing the configuration of price faced by the agents. And in that regard, the carbon pricing somehow has to be there and being applied according to the carbon intensity of whatever the products. Will that have potentially negative consequences in terms of income distribution? Yes. And that's where you have to think of the taxation on the other side or public budget as a whole to compensate a bit the inevitably negative distributional consequences of environmental taxation. Think of the following. Any decarbonization trajectory and the needs to refurbish real estate, right? To adapt real estate. Well, real estate is a major component of assets of the poor part of the income pyramid. So even any sort of a real estate to be rebuilt or retrofit, it will be, in terms of income distribution, negative for the latter part of the pyramid. So it not be denied. The role of the fiscal... Yes, sorry.
I'm getting signs from everywhere that we're behind our time. Yes. Abdul, unfortunately, there's no more time to respond. I think we can respond afterwards. We have, unfortunately, we have a constraint to end the last session. So I'll ask everybody to stay here so we can do the transition to the closing part of the conference smoothly and quickly so that people can take their train, their plane, their cars to go back home afterwards. Thank you very much for your participation in the session.
Really nice to listen to your session. Do you have a card? I forgot mine as well.
But
I'm sure I can find you on the website.
yes.
Yeah.
Both of us.
If you want, I have a jacket sort of like
Okay. Okay.
No, it's not finished yet. So as soon as finished, I will usher them up. And there. Yes. Okay. Well. Okay.
It's amazing because the weather outside is much better.
We have the final 2 sessions downstairs wrapping up, and we'll start in just 1 minute. Thank you all.
Okay, so so it's imperative to finish at 1 o'clock. I think one is done, one is about to.